Hello, Sarah with Melting Star Handmade here. In this video, I will show you how to make your very own Bluey and Bingo plushies using a free pattern by Choly Knight of Sodesune. If you've never heard of her, make sure to go check her out because she does a lot of really awesome patterns. She does free patterns that also include license-inspired characters, as well as paid patterns that are more advanced for more advanced sewers, of course. So make sure to check her out if you've never heard of her. In this sewing tutorial, I will be showing you how to do the embroidery machine files, or how I do them, so that you can get these nice clean details, including the stuff on the back here. If you do not have an embroidery machine, you also can do applique, which I have videos showing you how to use her patterns to do applique as well if you do not have an embroidery machine. If you want to sew this along with me, make sure you get the materials listed here, and make sure you also, if you're trying to follow along, pause the video if I'm going too fast, because these took me 4 hours to make each. I made the video much shorter than 4 hours, of course, so please pause if you need to. You can also request through the comments if you need me to post a slowed down version of a certain part, because I do want to I want to help you make these for your own. So please feel free to reach out if you need to. Also, if you just want to watch this because you want to see how I make it, that is perfectly fine as well. I hope you enjoy this video and that it is helpful for you to make your very own Bluey and Bingo plushies. Thanks for watching.
The first thing you'll want to do is download the free PDF from Choly Knight and then print out the pattern pages. I set the pieces for applique aside, then I cut out the pattern pieces on the solid black line. You don't want to cut around on the dotted black line because that's where you'll sew. I'm going to skip ahead and go to the next page so I can show you what I do with these little triangles. When I get to them, I always cut the opposite way to make a diamond so that I can see where things line up really well when we go to the sewing part. So I do cut that out on my fabric as well. Once I get to these little snips on the sides of the back and the front, I do cut those into the paper. That's not necessary. You can cut them out into the fabric when we get to that part. I'm going to skip ahead to when all these pattern pieces are cut out. Once I have the paper pieces cut out, I'm going to clean up and get ready to cut them out in fabric. You can see what color to cut them out in right on the pattern paper. I organized them in the colors I will be cutting them out in. I'm doing bluey, so I'll have a light blue, a medium blue, a dark blue, and a tan. I also sew Bingo off camera, so just to note that Bingo only has 3 colors when Bluey has 4 colors. Now that I have my fabric, I again organize the pieces with the colors so I could keep track. There's a lot of ways to cut out the fabric pieces. You can use air erase markers, you could just pin it straight to it. I even have discovered a way to use my Cricut to cut out fabric for me for large amounts of things I make. For this, I just decided to pin the paper straight to the fabric and then cut it out, making sure not to cut the paper as I do it if I want to reuse it. On pieces that I need doubles of, or mirroring pieces, I fold my fabric over to double it up. You could see me doing that here. And I pin it straight to it, or again, use the other ways that you make this, and it will make 2 of 1 item. I'm going to skip ahead in this video to when I have everything cut out so you don't have to watch this whole process. It does take some time. Pause the video if you need to. After getting everything cut out, I'm going to start adding the details. I need to find the 2 face pieces, the muzzle, the ears, and the back. If I'm ever unsure of which pieces is which, I can always refer back to my paper pattern like I do on the face here. I also want to note that Bingo will have an extra detail on her tail that Bluey does not have. Once I have my pieces I need to add detail to, I'm going to set the other pieces aside and prepare my embroidery hoop. If you do not have an embroidery machine, there are still other ways you can successfully make your own Bluey and Bingo using applique or even fabric paint. I do have a video on how to add applique to plushies, and I'll put the link in the video description. To start adding detail using my embroidery machine, I hoop a piece of tearaway stabilizer to my 5x7 hoop. Then I run the last stitch of Choly Knight's free embroidery file. This last stitch is normally intended to help know where to cut the fabric, but I use it as a placement guide for my pieces as I pre-cut them before adding the detail. Once I have the last stitch done, I add spray adhesive that is safe for the sewing machine. I then line up the pieces, making sure the right side is facing up. Because Choly Knight's file is ready to be used on a 4x4 hoop, I am doing 2 pieces at a time on my 5x7. Now that I have the face pieces in the hoop, I stitch the placement stitch to know where to place the white eye fabric. I then add the white fabric right side up, making sure it covers the placement stitch with plenty overhang. This is a perfect time to use any large scraps you may have. Once I have it placed correctly, I stitch the sew down stitch. I'm going to repeat this with the second eye. Now I'm going to trim the white fabric closely to the stitches without cutting the blue fabric or the stitches. I'm using my Pelican duckbill scissors, but these are not required. Any sharp scissors can work, you just need to be careful not to cut too close. I make sure that edges are cut nice and clean, and I use a pet hair remover to clean the little bits of fabric off. Leaving these on there can cause flaws in the embroidery. Next, I add my top stabilizer. I'm using a clear water-soluble stabilizer, and I make sure it covers the eye areas. I tape the stabilizer down with a masking tape, keeping it clear of any sewing areas. Now that I have my stabilizer secure, I can put the hoop back into the embroidery machine and run the satin stitch around the eyes. This does take a while to stitch out, but make sure to stay close to your machine so you can stop it if anything goes wrong. Once that stitch is complete, I can switch to a black thread and run the next step for the pupils. Right here, my machine foot snags the thread and tore the fabric from the stabilizer. It didn't ruin anything, and I was done embroidering this piece anyway, but I did have to cut it free. Now I'm going to trim all the little threads off and remove the stabilizer top and bottom. I even like to remove the stabilizer paper from the back of the eye, just so it doesn't have that extra stiffness behind the eye. Now that the eyes are all embroidered, I can move on to the muzzle. I again hoop my tearaway stabilizer and run the last stitch first, so I can use the stitching as a guide to place my muzzle piece. I'm going to move through this piece in the video a bit faster because it is very similar to how the eye is done. I start with the placement stitching step, then add the medium blue fabric and run the sew down step. I trim the blue fabric away similar to the eye, but this time I only need to focus on the inner parts of the muzzle where the satin stitch will be sewn. I will cut the rest of the blue off later once I remove the piece from the hoop. I'll again clean up the fabric bits with a pet hair remover and add the top stabilizer. I again secure the top stabilizer with masking tape, keeping it clear of the sewing area. I then run the satin stitch in blue, the nose in black, and a light gray shine, and the mouth in brown. I remove the threads and stabilizer like usual. The main difference that I want to show you with this piece is how I remove the extra fabric. Where the blue was sewn down with just a straight stitch, I cut right on the stitching, cutting through both the blue and the tan. I then cut away the extra tan on the wrong side of the muzzle. I do this to reduce the bulk and give my sewing machine a break on how many layers it's sewing through. Now that I've shown you how I do the eyes and the muzzle, I feel like the rest of the embroidery pieces are pretty self-explanatory. I will do the ears next. I did 2 sets because I wanted to make 2 blueies, then I did the back. I didn't use a top stabilizer with my anti-pill fleece, but I do recommend it still if you're using minky or other fabric with more pile. Also, just a reminder that if you're making Bingo, she also has an extra marking on her tail. Once all the details are added, I can start sewing. I set my machine to a short zigzag stitch, then I sew the darts of the eye pieces first. I sew these darts by folding the fabric along the point of the dart, making the right sides of the fabric touch and the edges line up. When sewing, I try to blend the stitching into the fold so it has a nice round shape to it, and I repeat it with both eyes. Now I'm going to sew the forehead dart. This dart is done similarly to the eye panels. Once I have the forehead dart done, I'm going to start sewing the eye panels to the forehead piece. I start by lining the top of both of them together and the bottom, and I clip or pin them together. I'd like to have the eyes facing up so I can keep an eye on whether I'm going to go over them or not when I am stitching, because they are very close to the edge. Now I sew just where the forehead touches the eye panel all the way from the bottom to the top. I will repeat that step with the other eye. Again, making sure the eye is facing up so I can kind of see where I want to be careful to not get too close to the edge. It is okay if you sew over the eye just a little bit because the muzzle will be covering it. I just like to try and make it so that it's very close but not actually sewn over. Once I have the forehead piece and the eye panels attached, I'm going to start attaching the ears. You want to make sure that when you hold the ear up, it does point straight up and not going off to this side. And then you pin and clip it in place and sew it on. When placing the ears, there is a little bump on each side of the forehead or the top of the head that kind of shows you where to place them between. If you can't see them or you're unsure where to place it, you could always use the paper patterns that have little dots and guiding marks to where to place these. Now we're going to prepare the body and belly front. I do this by clipping the corners a little bit so that when I add this belly piece, it will be easier to add to sew around the curves. I'm going to start by finding the middle of each piece. You also can use the paper pattern that has guiding marks. That will help you find this a little easier, or you could just fold it like I was doing to find the middle. This took me just a little bit because I had to figure out how to make sure that both right sides were facing when I clipped it. So make sure you're paying attention to that. The right sides need to be facing. And then I just tacked down the very center here with just a few stitches. And then I was able to manipulate the fabric to go around this curve. You always want to sew from the center out. So I start where I tacked down a few stitches, and then I sewed around the curve and to the bottom. And then I pin or clip the next side, making sure that I also sew again from the middle where I tacked down around the corner and to the bottom. Once the belly is complete, we can attach the head front to the body front. We do this by lining up the head piece to the neck edge. We fold them, make sure that the right sides are facing, and pin and clip them together. If you need to, there are guiding points to help you line this up. If you cut well, you should be able just to lie it on there and it can sew, or it lines up nicely. This is now our complete body front. Now we can attach the back ears to the back of the head. You do this by grabbing your head back pieces and your ear back pieces. I like to lay them out to make sure that the ears are facing the right way. You want them to point up. So once you figure out which side they go on, you can start attaching them by pinning or clipping the edges of the curve of the bottom of the ear to the curve at the top of the head back. You pin or clip them in place, manipulating the fabric as you need to so it can go along the curve, and then you sew it together. You repeat this step with the other ear and head back. Now we're going to take these head back pieces and sew them together to make a complete back of the head. We want to make sure that when we're pinning and clipping this, we're noting that there does need to be a gap for turning on this piece. So make sure that you either remember or clearly mark that there needs to be an opening for turning later. Once our head back is complete, including the opening for turning, we're going to sew the back of the body to the back of the head. Grab your body back piece and line them up along the neck area. Note there is a notch on the back that if you did do the diamond shape thing, that will line up directly on the back of the head seam. That helps you make sure that this back of the head and the back are lined up and centered well. Now we can sew along the seam. Once our body back is complete, we can add our body front to the body back. We will be joining them together all around the top and sides. The pieces should match up at the neck seams and around the ears. I like to line up the ears first, making sure that the seams go together, and then I go down the sides on each side. The neck seams should line up nicely as well as the ear seams. When sewing down the sides, I want to make sure that I skip where the dart openings are for the arms.
To help myself remember this, I decided to clip the dart now instead of later. I use the paper pattern, hold it up to the fabric, and cut through both layers of fabric and the paper. While sewing, make sure to slow down around the ears if you need to.
At this point, after I've sewn everything together, I like to check the seams and make sure I didn't miss anything, especially on the curves of the ears. If I think everything looks good, then I am going to move on to sewing the arms and the hands together. I make sure the right sides are facing of the hand and the arm, and I sew along the wrist edge. The wrist edge is also called point 13 if you're using your paper pattern as a guide. Once I've attached the arms to the hands, I open the piece up and fold it again lengthwise so it's skinnier than it was before. The seam should match up on the sides. I like to make sure that they're really matched up and held together well so that when I sew it, it doesn't shift and the color change of the arm to the wrist is very smooth. Once I've clipped these together well, I start at the top corner on the medium blue and go around the thumb and back down the hand. I try to blend the seam into the fold of the fabric, so I keep sewing around a little bit so that it has a nice smooth curve to it. And then I repeat these steps with the second arm.
Once I have the arms sewn, I need to clip the seam allowance around the fingers and the thumb. Make sure to also snip in the tight corner of the thumb and the hand so that when it turns, it lays nice and flat. Just make sure when you're trimming, you're not clipping any of the stitches. Once everything is trimmed, we can turn using hemostats or a chopstick. I prefer the hemostats because they're able to grab a hold and hang on while you turn it right side out. After I turn them, I'm going to lightly stuff them. I always get a little piece of stuffing and use my hemostats to push it into the thumb first. And then I push a little bit into the hands so that they're stuffed more firmly, and then I lightly stuff the arms as I go up. I stuff both arms at the same time so that I can have them a similar firmness. So I just double check to feel that they're about the same. When I feel that they're stuffed about the same, it's time to add them to the body. What I do is I put the belly side up while the stuffed animal is inside out, and put the thumb facing up towards the belly. And then I pinch it in the arm dart you see here, and make sure that it's sandwiched in right in the middle of that seam as much as I can have it centered there. And I pin or clip it in place and sew it together, making sure to hold that arm into that seam. This is a double-ended dart, so I just make sure that I try to sew from one point of the dart to the end, and while I'm sewing, I am trying to blend my stitching in and make it curve around the body's curve as much as I can. When I'm done sewing one arm, I always like to make sure that it is secure inside of the dart before I move on to the next one, so I can resew or adjust if I need to. And then I just repeat these steps with the second arm. Once we have both arms secured in the body, we're going to move on to sewing the bottom. We're going to attach the bottom front piece and the bottom belly piece. We want to attach them on the side that has point 18 if you're using your paper pattern to help you. Once I have the bottom belly and the bottom front attached, I am going to move on to sewing the feet. I'm going to find my leg pieces and my foot pieces and make sure I have them lined up where the wider part of the leg piece is attaching to the foot piece. Make sure my right sides are facing and pin or clip them so that I can sew along the side that has point 14. This is very similar to the arms where when you have them sewn where the ankle in this case is attached, you will open it up and fold it again so that it is skinny lengthways. And then we will sew from the top of the leg down towards the foot, and we'll stop at the toe area. Looks like I ran out of bobbin here, so now's a good time for me to remind you that if you like what you're seeing on my video, please make sure to like and subscribe so you can see more of my content. Now that we've sewn the foot and leg piece together, we're going to grab our foot bottom piece and we're going to join it along the opening of the foot that we left when we sewed the last step. You can use the markings point 15 and point 16 as an alignment if you would like. I honestly just clipped it all the way around and didn't really pay attention to the points. I just made sure I didn't have any extra fabric bulking up on one side, and I sewed both feet just like this. Be sure that right sides are facing and that you're taking your time to go around this small curve, pushing the leg out of the way as you go. I will repeat these steps with the second foot. Once I have both foot bottoms sewn on, I'm going to do the same like I did with the arms, and I'm going to trim away the seam allowance on any of the curves to make sure that when I turn it, it's not too bulky and it lays nice and flat and has a good shape to it. On these tiny curves, make sure to check your seams for any tiny holes that might have happened while you were sewing around or trimming. If everything looks good, you can turn it and start to lightly stuff
I do stuff a little extra in the toes, a little more firmly, and then stuff lightly as I go up the leg. You don't want the top of the legs very bulky because then the stuffed animal will struggle to sit properly. So you want the very top of the legs very loose and very, very lightly stuffed. Next, we're going to baste these legs we just stuffed to the bottom piece. You can use your placement marker from your paper pattern and clip them like I'm doing here, and then I pull the paper away so that I have the legs exactly where they are supposed to be. And then I just use a straight stitch and gently sew them in place. Once these are basted, I'm going to attach the front bottom to the top of these legs and make like a leg sandwich. So the legs are in the middle between the two bottom pieces. And then just sew back to a zigzag stitch so that they're nice and secure. Before I move on to the next thing, I just want to make sure that the legs are nice and secure and not going to fall off or tear. Once I'm happy with it, I can put the legs inside of the body here and line up the belly seams, the side seams, and sew all the way around this bottom circle here. While you're clipping this and sewing this, you want to make sure that the arms and legs are out of the way and not getting in your way for sewing or accidentally being sewn to the wrong place. You can also use your paper points as a guide if you need to. For me, I just made sure that my seams were lined up really nicely and that I didn't have any extra fabric bunching up anywhere. Again, I sew around this whole circle, just moving the arms and legs out of the way as I go around if I need to. Once the bottom circle is completely sewn, I just check the seams to make sure I didn't miss anything, and I start to trim away the seam allowance and clip in the corners to make sure that when I turn this plushie that it lays nice and flat and isn't bulky, especially in the ears. Now it's time to turn Bluey. I start by pulling the legs and the arms out first and the rest of the body. Once I get the head out, I use the hemostats to push the ears out so that they make nice cute points. Now I can begin stuffing Bluey. I'm going to start with little pieces that I put into the ear tips to make sure that they stand up nice and cute, and then I start adding polyfill to the bottom of the stuffed animal. I'm trying to keep the nice cylindrical shape that Bluey's characters always are while I'm stuffing. I try to kind of push the bottom down while I add stuffing around the seams to keep the shape so it doesn't turn into this weird, strange tube that's sticking out on the bottom. You want to keep that flat bottom, round belly look. So manipulate the polyfill as long as you need to get this nice shape. Once you get the belly filled the way you like, start filling the head. Start by pushing polyfill towards the face and then up towards the ears and work your way back to the opening of the head. When stuffing this especially, I try and make it so it's stuffed firm enough to keep the shape, but also soft enough so it has a nice squishy feel to it. People like squishy stuffed animals. Once I have Bluey stuffed the way I'd like, I'm going to pull some thread from my sewing machine, get my hand needle and tie a knot in my sewing thread. And then I'm going to ladder stitch the back of the head shut. You can always sneak some stuffing in right before you finish closing this hole if you want to make sure that the back of the head does not dent in. If you're a little new to ladder stitching, I do have a visual aid to help you kind of figure out how to do this, and I also have seen a lot of videos on YouTube with really good details on how to ladder stitch if you need some extra help on this part. I will try to add a link to one of my favorites in my video description. Now we can set Bluey aside and start sewing our muzzle. To start the muzzle, I'm going to sew all the darts first. I make sure the blue detail is lined up and sew from the outside of the muzzle in. The top two darts on either side of the nose, I don't blend the seams that much, so it keeps a nice pointed nose. I also make sure the mouth is lined up on the bottom dart. I've heard some people like to tack the mouth together with just a few hand-sewn stitches if they really struggle with it shifting during sewing. Once all the darts are sewn, I'm going to add the back of the muzzle. I find my center of the top and bottom on the back point 20 and 21. I line up point 21 with the bottom seam, and point 20 is the center of the top of the muzzle. I clip all the way around the muzzle, making sure the fabric is lying nicely, then I sew it all the way around the muzzle, making a closed shape. I then check my seams to make sure it didn't shift, and if it looks good, I snip a small hole in the center of the back and turn the muzzle right side out. Using the same hole I just cut, I stuff the muzzle with polyfill, making sure to get enough stuffing around the seams so that it has a nice shape and no wrinkles. Now I can find the placement of the muzzle and ladder stitch it on. I want the top of the muzzle to be about halfway up the eyes and centered between them. I used pins to help hold it in place while I sewed the first round of the ladder stitch. I placed my stitches near the seam of the muzzle back and made big stitches the first round. Once I was happy with its placement, I then made another round of ladder stitching, but this time with very tight, neat stitches, so it was nice and sturdy. Sewing through all the seams of the color changes and the multiple layers of fabric was a bit challenging, so make sure to take your time or even take breaks if you need to. I'm going to skip ahead in the video to when I'm finished ladder stitching this, as it did take me quite a bit of time. Once I finish the muzzle, I can put Bluey aside again and start sewing the eyebrows. I take the two sets of eyebrow pieces and place them right sides facing. I clip them all the way around the whole shape and sew both eyebrows all the way around. I did deviate from the instructions a bit on this step. I felt it would save some hand sewing. I then do a quick seam check and trim the seam allowance, just like I did with the muzzle. I snip a small hole in the back of the eyebrows, being careful to only cut through one layer of fabric. Once I have this hole snipped, I use the hole to turn the eyebrows right side out. Now I can add a little bit of stuffing to each eyebrow. I stuff them at the same time so that I can make sure that they are about the same size and the same squish to them. You don't want to overstuff these because then they'll be hard to sew to the head. When I have both eyebrows stuffed lightly and evenly, I'm going to whip stitch the openings that I created closed. Again, this is slightly different than what Choly Knight says to do on her pattern. Once I have it whip stitched closed, I'm going to go ladder stitch it to Bluey's face. Make sure it's placed about 1/4 of an inch above the eye, and the part that you whip stitch closed is facing the plush. I'm going to ladder stitch this all the way around the shape so it's nice and sturdy and it's not going to come off. I will repeat these steps with the second eyebrow as well. For this video, I'm going to skip ahead to when I have both eyebrows finished. At this point, I've finished sewing the eyebrows onto Bluey. Again, I'm going to set Bluey aside, and we're going to move on to sewing the tail tip to the tail base. I like to lay them out to see how they'll line up, and then flip them so that right sides are facing, and then I pin or clip them along this curve, also known as point 22, and sew along this edge. Once the tail tip is attached, we're going to fold it lengthwise and line up the dark blue and the medium blue. I like to put a clip right there so that that seam doesn't shift, and then I'm going to clip the rest of the tail together. I'll start sewing at the top corner of the medium blue and go around the dark blue, making sure to make the little curves so that the tail has a nice fluffy look to it. Once it's all sewn, I'm going to just check the seams to make sure I didn't miss anything while I was going around those curves. And then I'm going to trim the seam allowance, making sure to clip inside the corners of any of it. Once I have this all trimmed up, I am going to turn it with my hemostats. Now that I have it turned, I want to push out all the little curves again using my hemostats or a chopstick. This will make it easier on the next step, which is to stuff the tail. When I'm stuffing, I want to make sure I get little pieces of the polyfill in the curves of the tail, the little fluffs of the tail, so they hold their shape nicely, and then lightly stuff it as I go to the opening of the tail. Once I'm happy with how the tail is stuffed, I'm going to do a gathering stitch around the opening of the tail. I'm going to hold this to the body right above the bottom seam with the clinched end facing the plush. I'm going to ladder stitch around the base of the tail to hold it in place. I'm going to do a quick round ladder stitching this in place with large stitches. Then if I'm happy with the placement, I will do another round or two with smaller, neater stitches so it's nice and secure. I'm going to skip ahead in the video to when I have the ladder stitching of the tail finished. Now that the tail is fully ladder stitched, I'm going to start doing the needle sculpting detail on the hands. To start, I take my thread and double it up. I make a small knot at the end. I then search for a gap in the seam of the hand so that the knot can slide through. Once I find an opening, I bring my needle out at the top of the sculpting line. If you're not sure where to do this, you can always check the paper pattern. Once I have the needle out, I pull the knot through. Now I wrap the thread around the other side of the hand so that the thread goes over the end of the hand. I then insert the needle back into the other side of the sculpt line and through the other side of the hand. I pull gently so that the thread creates a light indent into the hand until I have the definition I want. I make sure not to pull too tight so I don't break the thread. I do this once or twice more, then skip to the next sculpting line for the next finger, and repeat the previous steps to complete this hand. I want to apologize for my camera angle on this one. Next time I'll try and get a better shot when I'm needle sculpting. I think I just got really into it and forgot that I was supposed to be on camera. I tie the thread off and clip it, then move on to the next hand. I repeat this all again for the second hand and the 2 feet. I'll skip ahead in the video to when I have all the needle sculpting finished. Once I have completed all the needle sculpting on the hands and feet, my Bluey is complete. Let's get a better look at Bluey and Bingo too. Here they both are completely finished. You can see the needle sculpting here on the hands and feet. The details look really nice on both of them. They are nice and cuddly with the squishy body and the floppy arms and legs. I hope this video tutorial was helpful for you to create your own Bluey and Bingo. If you do make your own, I would love to see it. Thank you so much for watching.